When I was 16, I was going to school for a school for missionary children in the north part of India. And I was a missionary's kid. And being 16, I was in love. True love, of course. The problem was that my girlfriend was leaving school to go back to the United States. This broke my heart. And I thought, in order to properly say goodbye, we should get somewhere on the campus and have enough privacy to say goodbye in a proper way. Now, this may seem innocent to you, but for me, at 16, in this time, in this place, what I was about to do, which was to kiss her, was a high crime and misdemeanor. So we made arrangements to get behind the curtains on the stage of the auditorium. And we had a time to meet there, and we met there, and just about the time I was ready to embrace her and kiss her, the curtains rustled more than they should have, and in walked my teacher. Now, Mr. Keelan was a very austere British gentleman. His family had been in India for several generations, part of the British Raj. He was not given to much levity or fun. He was a scientist. He taught me math, and he taught me chemistry, and he taught me physics. I was a reader for him. He was my employer. And I thought, I am really in big trouble now. Kids got expelled for things much less than this. At my school, at Vincent Hill School in India, when I was 16, you could get expelled for thinking about kissing a girl, not even. And he walked, if this is the stage, and I'm at this end with Blanche, and he walks in on this end, he walked the entire length of the stage, never making eye contact, walked right by me and Blanche, walked down the stairs and out the auditorium. He never looked at me, and he never said a word. I was petrified. Well, how was I going to explain to my dad that I couldn't go to school there anymore because I'd been expelled from school for kissing a girl behind the stage goodbye because she was going back to America? Every day I kept expecting the call to come to the principal's office, but it never came. Many, many years later, when I would visit Mr. Keelan at school there, I finally summoned up the courage to ask him if he remembered this incident, which remarkably he did. And I asked him, what were you thinking? What was the reason for your ignoring this high crime and misdemeanor that I was caught in? And he said, something about, I think you needed to learn something about grace. Wow. certainly made a lasting impression on me, that's for sure. For the last 12 weeks in our Sabbath school class, we've been discussing the subject of grace. So those of you who are in my Sabbath school class, I'll give an apology because since they called me just a few hours ago, actually about 24 hours ago, to make a sermon, I put together some material that we've been talking about to share with you the subject of grace. I don't apologize, on the other hand, for talking about grace, because grace is something that Jesus spent most of his time here on earth talking about. If you look at the parables that Jesus told, well over half of the parables are parables of grace. And a whopping proportion of the time he spent in teaching, he was teaching about grace. In his parables and in his stories, in his message, Jesus seems to say that what's so amazing about grace is that even though it's free, it's really hard for God to give it away. Now, the concepts of judgment and mercy are commonly held ideas and theological positions of all great religions. That you should be judged for what you do, that you should be given punishment or reward for your activity, is a common theme in all religion. But the concept of grace is a uniquely Christian concept, deeply rooted, as you, I think, can understand, in the message of the cross. Despite its origins as a completely, uniquely Christian concept, a Pew survey done last year of Christians in North America showed that 83% of Catholics and 52% of Protestants believe that you are not saved by grace alone, but that you are saved by grace and by works. It's remarkable that the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which arguably was constructed on the basis of this single argument as to whether or not you were saved by work or whether you were saved by grace alone, that now 52% of Protestants believe that you are not saved by grace alone, but by both grace and by works. Why is this concept such a difficult concept to accept? I think part of it is that deeply rooted inside us is the idea that there is no such thing as a free lunch. The idea that we can be the recipients of a lavished, unbridled, unmitigated, and unmerited kindness is just foreign to our thinking and certainly lacks an authenticity. It just isn't right. It isn't fair. And above all, it isn't just. You see, we live in a world where cause and effect are the operations of what we understand and what we deal with on a day-by-day basis. But the kingdom of heaven, you see, is not like the real world. In the kingdom of heaven, the laws of physics are suspended. People can walk on water in the kingdom of heaven. People can rise into the air in the kingdom of heaven. In the kingdom of heaven, economic principles are also different. If someone asks you for one, you give them two. The social laws are different as well. If you want to be the first, you go to the end of the line. So the kingdom of heaven is a strange place, and one of the things that doesn't work in the kingdom of heaven is the laws of cause and effect. As a matter of fact, in the kingdom of heaven, cause and effect is replaced by the concept of grace. You see, grace is a little bit like oxygen. It's everywhere. There's plenty of it around. It's free for the taking. It's accessible to everyone. It's in unlimited supply. But also in the teachings of Jesus, you see that there's one other very important principle about grace that makes it like oxygen. The more you work, the more you exercise, the more you need oxygen. You need more oxygen. And Jesus recognized that the more we sought to do our own work, the more we sought to do our own thing, we needed more grace as well. In 1937, as the Nazi regime was rising to its peak of power in Europe, a German Lutheran pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer published a book entitled The Cost of Discipleship. Some of you may have read the book. This book, as much as anything, has influenced Protestant thinking on the subject of grace. It is considered by most theologians to be a modern classic. It was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who coined the term cheap grace, in contrast to what he termed costly grace. For him, cheap grace was grace without baptism, grace that required effort, grace without contrition. Costly grace was grace which involved our participation in understanding what God's role in our salvation was. The idea that we must do something to receive grace, that there are expectations to be fulfilled in order to enjoy God's grace, is not a new concept. The early church fathers spent a great deal of time talking about this subject of grace, and they developed many theories concerning the subject of grace and contrition. I want to turn this morning in our discussion to the story of the Prodigal Son as a study in the subject of grace. It's found in the 15th chapter of the book of Luke. It begins in verse 11. A certain man, Jesus said, had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate that falls to me. And he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in the land, and he began to be in need. And he went and attached himself to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the field to feed swine. And he was longing to fill his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, but no one would give him anything to eat. But when he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him. And he ran and embraced him, and he kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this son of mine was dead, and he has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing, and he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring, What are these things? And he said to him, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he received him back safe and sound. But he became angry and was not willing to go in, and his father came out and began entreating him. And he answered and said to his father, Look, for so many years I've been serving you, and I've never neglected a command of yours, and yet you never gave me a kid that I might be merry with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, 'My son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to be merry and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and is found.'" The English word prodigal is an interesting one. On the one hand, its meaning is extravagant and wasteful and profligate, but it also means generous and lavish and liberal. Literally, probably the best English word we have for prodigal is bounteous. The story in Luke 15 that we've just read might well be renamed the prodigal father, given the generous and lavish and liberal and bounteous administration of grace which is demonstrated in this story. Notice that the lavishness of grace begins at the beginning of the story and goes all the way through to the end. In the first place, the inheritance of the father is not due to the children until the father dies. You see, a prudent father would have known about the likely behavior of his son. He would have understood his son's personality and the likelihood that he would waste this kind of gift. His first, most prudent activity would have been to simply refuse the request as utterly inappropriate. Another option would have been to set conditions upon the use of the inheritance. He must spend it only in certain ways, or only in certain amounts, only on certain things. Some conditions and boundaries should have been placed before the son in order that the son not be so reckless in his spending. At a minimum, it seems he should have divided the estate according to the conventions of seniority outlined in the scriptures. The birthright, you see, should receive, the elder son, the son of the birthright, should receive a double portion. In Deuteronomy 21, but he shall acknowledge the firstborn, giving him a double portion of all that he has, for it is the beginning of his strength. To him belongs the right of the firstborn. But if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his own home, and they shall say to the elders of the city, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. And all the men of the city shall stone him to death, so that you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all children shall hear of it and fear." This is parental guidance for those of you with a stubborn son. What this young son really needed, what really should have occurred, was he should have been stoned. But instead, not only does he get the inheritance, but he gets an equal share of the inheritance, which is more than he should have received. The lavishness of the prodigal father's grace. The famine he encounters is not just a famine of food and provisions. His famine is a spiritual famine, one as well, and not only has his economic capital been expended, but his spiritual capital has been expended too. What he received as a youth in his father's house of spiritual strength and underpinnings is gone. So he devises a plan to return, and it is based on the recognition of his desperate condition. His plan to return to the Father's house is based on his willingness to relinquish his sonship. It is based on contrition and confession and his own self-assessment, as well as his self-assessment of his father's condition. This is what the prodigal son is prepared to do. On one level, you see, this parable is about the relationship between God and man, about God's graciousness and about the open arms of God. Without undermining this face value, at a deeper level, I think we may see this as a story about man's relationship with himself. It shows the turmoil that occurs within us as we live our lives as sinful human beings. I think that we see our original and proper standing before God as his sons and daughters. You see, we are created in God's likeness. We are in his spiritual likeness and his physical likeness. We are in his spiritual image. We have, as it were, the spiritual nature of DNA which is within us. Several key themes emerge from the parable about grace. First, by leaving home, the prodigal son was really making an unspoken but clear statement that he no longer wished to be his father's son. Strictly speaking, the inheritance should only have come to him upon the death of his father. So in demanding it while his father was still alive, he was in a way saying, "You are dead to me, Father. I do not desire any longer to be your son." The second thing is reconnection. The word religion means to reconnect, to reestablish a connection with the source of origin. So the reconnection which occurs in the parable, as the parable unfolds, may be what religion is really all about. There are correlations in this parable between the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, who left the Garden of Eden in a sense on their own accord by willfully disobeying God. The prodigal son leaves his paradise also of his own volition after making the willful decision that he no longer wished to be the father's son. He left furthermore with his father's inheritance, which was not simply a monetary inheritance, but a spiritual inheritance, a blessing as well. His father had given him spiritual wealth, spiritual capital that seems to have served him well for a long time. But because he was disconnected from his father's house, because he was disconnected from the father's source of spiritual capital, it could not be replenished and could not be expected to live forever, could not expect it to last forever. Similarly, God did not leave Adam and Eve entirely unprovided for. He cursed the ground to cultivate and to live on, but it was cursed and it could not support them forever. Both accounts teach us that there needs to be some connectivity, some connection with God in order for the spiritual capital to be replenished that we need. In the parable, the spiritual as well as the monetary capital is spent in a far country, which emphasizes the extent of the prodigal son's alienation from his spiritual roots, his spiritual moorings. His spiritual identity was established at his father's house, but he became estranged, alienated, lost in that country. He suffered spiritual loneliness and disconnection. Nonetheless, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the father was closer to the son than the son was to the father. The kingdom of God, Jesus said, is within us. So despite the fact that we're in a far country, despite being separated physically, his father's spirit, his spiritual DNA, remained within this prodigal son. It never left him. As he made his way home, his father saw him from afar. You remember the words. It was as if the father was able to see his son all the way back to the far country to which he had journeyed. It seems that no matter how far he was away in the far country, the father's vision of him afar indicates that he was still within the view of the father. No matter how far we stray from God, the inner light, the Holy Spirit of our Father, still flickers within us. Despite his geographic distance from home, the prodigal son was still functioning within the context of the spiritual moorings that his father had given him at home. In that sense, there was no distance, you see, between them. This leads me to conclude that this story is as much about the man's struggle with himself as it is about man's struggle with God. From the father's point of view, his prodigal son had not really left him. The parental DNA was still within him. His father still loved him and reached out to him and indeed could see him no matter how far he journeyed away. In that sense, you see, although we left the Garden of Eden, we really never left the Father's presence. The willful distancing of ourselves from God is really a self-illusion, a self-delusion, a self-deceit, a denial and betrayal of what is really real. What we think has happened, either that we have left God or that God has left us, is just simply not true. We remain forever his sons and daughters. We are still made in his image. We contain and carry his DNA. The original sin then seems to be that we either forgot or suppressed who we were originally through and who we still are. The sin of the prodigal son was not that he took his father's wealth. His sin was not that he left for a far country, but that he forsake and he forgot or he suppressed who and what he really was. He represents none other than the false self that causes us to feel alienated from God. We betray our own identity before God because we are his sons and his daughters. But in our self-delusion, we sever that filial bond and the vital spiritual moorings, and we walk out the front door. Deviating from that mark, straying from being what we should be, deluding ourselves that we are something we are not is literally what sin means. It is a term from archery, which means to miss the mark. So the paradox in this story is that to God there is no journey. There is no far-off destination. There is no alienation, but to us there is, because in our souls we have put it there. We have lost our self-identity. We have lost our core being. We have fallen into the delusion that we have lost or squandered our spiritual heritage. In the first part of the parable, the son receives the inheritance for the father. In the second part, he journeys to the far country and he squanders the wealth. In the third part, he is confronted with his sense of want or need or lack. The context was this famine that we referred to earlier. He is spiritually famished. He is spiritually devastated. He recognized for the first time what he had done. He had separated himself from his roots, from his father, and from his own true self. That is why the very next phrase about coming to himself is so significant. It signified a reawakening of who he was and what he was and his true source and his true nature. It was the truth that set him free. Free from his prison of self-delusion and doubt. Free from trying to satisfy his spiritual hunger by eating spiritual pig swill. As he came to himself, he realized how far he had deviated from his roots and from himself. And so in the fourth and final part of the parable, he comes home to take his right and proper place in his Father's home in the kingdom of heaven. This, you see, is a parable about what true religion is all about. Reconnecting with God. It shows that God's grace is everlasting, ubiquitous, and free. And the authentic message is that we should forsake our self-delusions, our egocentric misrepresentations of who we are, and sacrifice our ego so that we see ourselves for who we really are, sons and daughters of God who need our Father desperately. The prodigal son is hopeful, yet apparently uncertain. He's uncertain whether his father will accept his contrition, will extend the forgiveness that he needs, whether his contrition will be adequate so the Father's grace can be received. The only thing he has left to give up, the only thing he has left to offer the Father is his sonship. So he comes with the opening line, "Father, I've sinned, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." That's all he's got. Armed with this self-devised contrition, he musters up his courage to return to the Father's house. What happens then could not have been anticipated, I think, by the son. It certainly was not anticipated by the elder son or by the servants. It seems to defy logic and reason. It certainly seems to defy justice. It is lavish, excessive, even profligate. It is grace without limits. and without boundaries. It is offensive, it's unjust, it's highly inappropriate. Anyone, I think, in their right mind would agree with the elder son that this is just not right. But grace, you see, is not about being in your right mind. It's not about cause and effect. Cause and effect is about being in your right mind. Grace is about being out of your mind. It is wild and it's crazy. It's the reckless love that Josh just sang about. It is the joy of finding something eternally precious that you thought you had lost forever. It's so unbelievable, as the Father says, that it feels like something that was dead just came to life. Noticeably absent from this story is what happens to the younger son. We would like the story to be wrapped up in a nice, neat package by Jesus. Straighten it out, son. Straighten up, fly right. Become responsible. Shun iniquity. Show that the grace that you've been given was grace that was deserved. But Jesus has nothing of that in the story. I think it's absent. Is intentional by Jesus. Because you see, we want to always make grace about us, when really grace is all about God. We want to deserve grace. We want to show that grace deserves us, when it's really about God and his unmerited kindness. So what do we do with grace? The work that we must do with grace is to pass it on. Grace hoarded, you see, becomes toxic grace. It's grace, if to be accepted, must be passed along. We see this concept of the toxicity of hoarding grace over and over and over in the scriptures. It begins in the Old Testament with the story of manna that comes as evidence of God's grace on a daily basis to the Israelites as they're transitioning between Egypt and the Promised Land. But grace which is held over becomes toxic. It becomes spoiled and rotten. The servant with the single talent buries it in the ground in an act of hoarding of his grace. The elder son in this parable is hoarding this father's grace for himself and can't extend it to his needy younger brother. I believe that we as Christians need to discuss and talk more about grace. We must talk about it more because Jesus talked about it more. In fact, there is no subject more broadly spoken of by Jesus than the subject of grace. So I invite you today to think about that, to talk about grace, to accept grace, to revel in the grace, to appreciate the grace, to thank God for the grace, and then to pass it along to others.